Hi everyone, how are you? Welcome to another question and answer session for MRCS exam. This is physiology portion of MRCS. A 5 years old present with a recurrent headache. As a part of this assessment, he undergoes an MRI scan of his brain. This demonstrates enlargement of the lateral and third ventricle. Where is the most likely site of the obstruction? So here we can see a 5 years old man, boy present with a recurrent headache. As it is assessment undergo MRI scan of the brain is done, and there shows that lateral ventricle and third ventricle, they are obstructed, they are dilated or enlargement. So what is the most likely obstruction? So we have to find out the obstruction site. Here findings is MRI findings is lateral ventricle and third ventricle enlargement. That means the obstruction occurs distal to the lateral ventricle and third ventricle. So we have to find out the distal part of the third ventricle. So for this we have to know details about the cerebrospinal fluid pathway or CSF pathway. We know that the lateral ventricle and third ventricle actually they conveys the cerebrospinal fluid. Here the options are foramen Lasca, foramen Magendie, foramen Monroe, aqueduct of Sylvius, and none of the above. So let's see the CSF pathway. So here we can see the formation. The cerebrospinal fluid or CSF, it is formed in the lateral ventricle. There are two important lateral ventricle on the right side and left side. So from the lateral ventricle, this CSF enters into the third ventricle by a foramina, which is the foramen of Monroe. So this point is very important, that from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, the CSF enters in the third ventricle through the foramen of Monroe. Then from the third ventricle, fluid enters into the fourth ventricle, and in this area it passes through the aqueduct of Sylvius. So here the aqueduct of Sylvius, it enters into fourth ventricle, and from the fourth ventricle through the foramen Magendie and foramen Lusca, it enters into the subarachnoid space. Here we can see it enters the cisterna magna and cisterna lateralis, and finally enters into the subarachnoid space and central canal. So from here we can see the from the third ventricle, fourth ventricle, there is foramen, which is the foramen of Monroe. So if any obstruction occur in the foramen of Monroe, in this condition the lateral ventricle will be enlarged. And from the third ventricle, here we can see aqueduct of Sylvius. So if any obstruction occur in the aqueduct of Sylvius, there will be increase of the ventricle, which is third ventricle and also the lateral ventricle. So if any obstruction occur in this area, which is the aqueduct of Sylvius, in this condition the lateral ventricle will increase and also the third ventricle increase. And if the foramen Magendie and foramen Lusca, they both obstruction occurs, then the fourth ventricle, third ventricle, and the lateral ventricle will be enlarged. So it is very simple regarding the CSF pathway. And in the second picture, here also we can see this is the lateral ventricle, then third ventricle, then fourth ventricle. And from the lateral ventricle to third ventricle, foramen of Monroe, and from the third ventricle to fourth ventricle, there is aqueduct of Sylvius. So here showing the different foramina. First of all, here we can see this foramen of Monroe, and this foramen of Monroe, it conducts the CSF from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, and from the third ventricle to fourth ventricle, there is a cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of the Sylvius. Here we can see cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius, and then foramen of Magendie and foramen of Lusca, and finally subarachnoid space. So it is the diagrammatic view of the CSF pathway or cerebral spinal pathway. So first of all, this is the lateral ventricle, then third ventricle, but between them a foramina, which is the foramen of Monroe. So if obstruction occurs here, obstruction occurs in this foramen of Monroe, so the lateral ventricle CSF will not be drained, and this condition lateral ventricle will be enlarged. And another, here we can see this is the aqueduct of Sylvius or cerebral aqueduct. If obstruction occurs, then proximal two ventricles, that means lateral ventricle, and third ventricle will be enlarged. It is showing another view here, the lateral ventricle, which is the more large. So this is the lateral ventricle. This lateral ventricle is more large, and here the choroid plexus. So from the choroid plexus, CSF is produced, and this comes to this, which is third ventricle, through foramen of Monro, and from the third ventricle to this fourth ventricle, another foramen, which is the aqueduct of Sylvius, or cerebral aqueduct, and from the fourth ventricle it through the foramen of Mazzenti and foramen of Lusca, it enters into the spinal canal and also in the subarachnoid space. This is the another pathway, the same condition from lateral ventricle. There, first of all, lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, then spinal canal and subarachnoid space. So it is in short review of the circulation of the cerebrospinal fluid, and different foramina present in this pathway, such as the foramen of Mazzenti, foramen aqueduct of foramen of Monro, aqueduct of Sylvius, then medial aperture foramen Mazzenti, and lateral aperture foramen Lusca. So here it is now ready that the lateral ventricle and third ventricle index, that means from the third ventricle to fourth ventricle there is blockage, and this is the aqueduct of the Sylvius. And other options such as the foramen of Lusca, we know that the foramen of Lusca, L for L, foramen of Lusca, it is the L for L, that means foramen of Lusca, it lies laterally in the fourth ventricle, and they are two in number, because the foramen of Lusca, it is lateral side located, and laterally on each side there is a foramen. Then foramen of Mazzenti, M for medial, M for medial. So the foramen of Mazzenti, it lies medially in the fourth ventricle. So it is now easy to remember that foramen of Lusca, which is L, that means it is laterally located. Then foramen of Mazzenti, it is M, that means medially located. Then foramen of Monro, this foramen of Monro, it connects the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. The lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, and none of the above, it is not option. Because the third ventricle and fourth ventricle, between them there is a foramina, which is the aqueduct of Sylvius. So it is all about the CSF pathway, cerebrospinal pathway, and the important foramina. Four or five important foramina present in the CSF pathway. First of all, is the foramen Monro, then foramen cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Sylvius, foramen Mazzenti, and foramen Lusca. So they are the normal foramen, and it connects the cerebrospinal fluid with the different ventricle. Thank you all.